Welcome back. Happy May 20th, 2021. We spoke of this before, but it's all right because repetition, as you know, is the essence of pedagogy. Over the past few days, a few callers have wanted me to discuss how we know when we Americans can legitimately rise up under the natural right of revolution, given usurpations of rights, arrogations of power, corruption, etc. A large part of this comes from, of course, a doubting of the ability to let free elections solve our political disagreements. Another way to ask this: how in a Republican form of government do we handle a disappointment or loss we firmly believe the result of unfairness, irregularity, or fraud? The question is, of course, not new, though it is anew with us today. It goes back to our very founding, in fact. And Abraham Lincoln was obsessed with this issue from his earliest speech, his Lyceum speech. And then, of course, again when he was and throughout his presidency, asking, is there in all republics this inherent and fatal weakness? Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its own people or too weak to maintain its own existence? It's an uncomfortable discussion because it asks for an extreme solution that is unprecedented for nearly 250 years here. But political philosophy deals with extremes in order, at best, to soothe them into responsible politics and polities. I think we should always start the discussion with its origins in the Declaration of Independence. This is where we find the phrase, quote, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness, close quote. But the next part is just as important. And in legal analysis and reasoning, the second, the third, the following sentences are always deemed more important than the earlier ones. General rule of legal interpretation. Quote, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for the future security, close quote. I've spoken a good deal about what Jefferson says regarding prudence. I think it's equally important to reflect on the words absolute despotism. The condition is absolute despotism as a result of a long train of abuses and usurpations. But Thomas Jefferson, of course, is also invoked on this subject when he wrote from France in 1787 about the Shays Rebellion, quote, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure, close quote. Forgotten often is the fact that this line of Jefferson's horrified George Washington, prompting him to try to create a government strong enough in Philadelphia at the convention that year to keep this sentiment from running riot. Riot. Good word, that. James Madison was on to this, too, as he put it in Federalist 51, a line conservatives don't much love, but it is their, quote, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. In A New Birth of Freedom, Professor Harry Jaffa writes this about Jefferson's letter. Jefferson's reaction to Shays' rebellion contrasts remarkably with the reactions of Washington, Madison, Hamilton, and other leading founders. For them, That rebellion proved a catalyst for the convention that framed the Constitution of 1787, a document that had no more urgent purpose than to provide security for property against popular passions. Property was being endangered in the states by the people seeking relief from debt, either through the legislature or by mob action. But despite his reaction to Shays' rebellion, no one was more committed than Jefferson to the security of property under the rule of law, in popular no less than in other kinds of government. Jefferson always believed that the people are the origin of all the just powers of government, that it is by the majority alone that the people can act. But in keeping with his view that an elective despotism was not the government Americans fought for, Jefferson believed with the other founders in the danger of majority tyranny. The rights of minorities, meaning the rights of individuals, were no less inviolable by the kings than by people. And he thought that popular governments were subject to corruption, and that resistance to corruption might be manifested in resistance even to popular governments. The right of revolution, which underlay all the people's rights, might then be manifested either in violent resistance to corrupt or tyrannical governments, or in the institution and maintenance of popular governments deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. In the 1790s, Jefferson was frequently of two minds as to whether the government instituted as a result of the ratification of the Constitution deserved loyalty as an embodiment of the people's rights, or whether it deserved resistance for having usurped powers never given to it by the people. The transformation of the right of revolution into the right of free election really begins with Thomas Jefferson's own party victory in 1800. We are reminded that Lincoln's first great speech, the Lyceum Speech, 1838, had as its theme the particular importance in a popular government of reverence for the laws and obedience to them. Lincoln stressed the necessity of obeying even bad laws while working for their repeal or reform, because disobedience to bad laws engenders a habit of lawlessness that easily turns into mob rule. And when law cannot protect persons and property, men will turn away from the rule of law to despotism for their security. Indeed, Lincoln's understanding in this speech of the dangers of lawlessness for popular government, or of the inexorable connection between anarchy and tyranny, was substantially the same as the one that animated those who called for the Convention of 1787. Now, that all said, I know there are a lot of questions raised, but let's start with a few facts of history, starting with that Thomas Jefferson didn't even apply his own 1787 standard to himself when he was president. As the Pulitzer Prize-winning constitutional historian Leonard Levy writes in an entire book about Jefferson's violations of civil liberties, called Jefferson and Civil Liberties, The Darker Side, Jefferson at one time or another supported loyalty oaths, countenanced internment camps for political suspects, drafted a bill of attainder, urged prosecutions for seditious libel, trampled on the Fourth Amendment, condoned military despotism, used the army to enforce laws in time of peace, censored reading, chose professors for their political opinions, and endorsed the doctrine that the means, however odious, were justified by the ends. Easy to write, somewhat irresponsibly, from France, I guess. A little different where you're in your own country and the president. For example, we have something in America called the Insurrection Act. Many of us wanted President Trump to use it to put down the BLM and Antifa riots last year. It was the cause of Tom Cotton's op-ed in the New York Times that led to the New York Times editorial page immolating itself. Guess who signed the Insurrection Act into law? Thomas Jefferson. He did so after writing to his Secretary of State, James Madison, asking if he could use military troops against a planned insurrection. Madison said he could not, and thus came about the Insurrection Act, allowing for that. Think about what a revolution in the name of Jefferson's principles would mean when it would be put down by an invocation of law and practice Thomas Jefferson created. Think about that. Now, if I may go back to Professor Jaffa for a moment, if an individual's discontent with a law is shared with a majority or a large minority of his fellow citizens, they may join together to resist it or to have the law repealed or declared unconstitutional in the courts. And the best example in our own time of how these processes are related to each other is provided by the civil rights movement that culminated in the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965 and 1968. Here, civil disobedience, court action, political action, and finally legislative action all conspired to produce an outcome that in all likelihood would not have come to pass without all of them. These same elements, in differing proportions, have been present in all the great political movements and controversies in American history, including anti-slavery, temperance, women's suffrage, and abortion. Finally, there was a question of the terms of the revolution and what it would look like. It is often pointed out that few Americans actually fought in the American Revolution, true enough, but they fought it against a foreign power. We have experiences with civil war as well, though, here too, as Americans, don't we? American against American. Are we ready for that in a country that hinges on something close to a 51-49 preference for views, not our own? One of the problems with violence against America is it will always be violence against fellow Americans. And it will not be successful. It will be bloody and it will fail. It is also inconsonant with everyone we want to revivify and study, from Washington to Lincoln. As the old man Lincoln put it, there is no grievance that is a fit object of redress by mob law. Oh, sure, Antifa thinks there is. BLM thinks there is. Not us. We, as Lincoln put it, build pillars hewn from the solid quarry of sober reason. I'm Seth. We'll be right back.